I arrived for the service. The chapel bell screamed once, off key, before fading into the cold courtyard. No son, no daughter, no grandchildren, just flowers too bright for grief and the wind flipping the guest book's empty pages. The pastor asked if I wanted to wait. I shook my head. Walt hated being late. I unlocked my phone, more out of habit than hope. On the Blue F app, their faces lit up my screen, champagne flutes raised, gold confetti flying, captions bragging, deal closed. Celebration time, the soundless video looped while the organ began its hymn. I turned the phone face down on the front pew. Begin, I told the pastor, as the first prayer echoed through the hollow room. I knew this wasn't only my husband's burial. It was the end of waiting for calls that never came, for love that never showed up. And if you think this is where the story ends, stay with me because what I buried that day wasn't just a man. Walt was a man of tidy rituals. 6 o'clock meant tea kettle whistling, cup warmed, 1 sugar, no fuss. He folded his slippers side by side at the foot of the bed like 2 small boats at anchor. The evening news clicked on at 6 sharp. He never argued with clocks. People mistake routine for boredom. Walt's habits were his love letters unflashy, daily, dependable, when he peeled the apples. He cut them into thin crescents and saved the sunniest slice for me. When he locked the back door, he tapped the knob twice to be sure. Even the garden obeyed him. Roses stood straighter when he passed. I learned his rhythms the way you learn a familiar hymn by heart, without needing the lyrics. That's what steadiness feels like when you live inside it. A room with a floor that never gives way. And then one day the music stops, and you're left counting beats in a silence no metronome can tame. The service ended quickly, the kind clerks whispering condolences to empty pews as if the room itself might bruise. I signed the guest book alone, my pen skating past a long column of blank lines. Outside, the wind pushed the door open like it wanted me gone. My phone vibrated in my coat pocket. Mike, finally. Sorry, Mom, something came up. No punctuation, no specifics, just enough words to feel like a sentence. I stared at it until the screen dimmed. When you raise a son, you imagine the day he lifts your weight for a step or two. You don't picture him letting go at the grave. I typed nothing back. There's a kind of breath you take when you decide not to beg. The funeral director held the door for me, Mrs. Lawson. Thank you, I said, the 2 most honest words I had left, and walked into an afternoon that didn't know what it had taken. Kelly never called. On the Blue F app, she posted a carousel mimosas sweating in tall glasses, sunlight glancing off a silver bracelet, 3 women leaning into each other with the practiced ease of people who caption their own lives, living our best lives. I tried to imagine the sound in that room ice, laughter, a fork chiming against china. I wanted to be generous, to tell myself grief lands late, that she'd see the notification tomorrow and understand. But the photo had timestamps, and the light in her eyes was the kind that asks nothing of the day but pleasure. I put the phone face down again. A mother's memory is a crowded hallway. Every new image bumps into all the little ones, Kelly in grass-stained knees, Kelly begging for another story, Kelly asleep in a back seat after a recital. I could love all those versions and still be furious with this one. Both can be true. Home was too quiet, the kind of quiet that hums. The lock clicked louder than it used to. Walt's slippers sat where he'd always left them, patient to a fault. The Afghan he favored drooped over the recliner like a tired flag. I stood in the doorway and waited for the house to greet me. Out of habit, the kettle's rattle, the floor's friendly complaint. It didn't. Dust had a smell. I knew it now. I set my keys in the blue bowl by the phone and listened to them settle. There's a difference between solitude and vacancy. Solitude is a chair you choose. Vacancy is a chair that stays empty no matter how you set the table. The refrigerator purred like a cat, pretending not to notice it's alone. I opened the curtains and let the late light in. It skated across Walt's glasses on the end table, finding the scratch he never got around to fixing. I opened a bottle we'd saved for guests, the kind with a cork that sighs when you get it right. The first glass went down like a promise I didn't have to keep anymore. On the wall, our wedding photo, two people squinting at a future they were sure they deserved. We planted roses that spring, red as if they'd learned color directly from the heart. Now the canes stood thorny and stripped. Honest about winter, I pressed my thumb against the glass frame and remembered the exact heat of that day. The weight of tulle. Walt's nervous grin. Love ages the way wood does. The grain shows, the shine dulls, and the thing becomes itself. I carried my glass to the back door and looked out at the garden. It was all still there, beds, stakes, the tilted bird bath, and also gone, because the pair of eyes that named it beautiful were not beside me. The last months of Walt were a syllabus of small courage. Pill schedules taped to the fridge, check marks neat as fence posts. He never lied to me, not about pain, not about fear, but he would tidy it, the way he tidied drawers. It's a 6 out of 10 today. Let's not give it a 7. He still took out the trash on Thursdays, still smoothed the quilt, still insisted on shaving even when nobody but me would notice. We measured time in infusions and sitcom reruns. In mugs of broth he insisted tasted like clouds pretending to be soup. He hated fuss, so I learned to be good at quiet care, the kind that keeps its hands busy and its voice plain. When he couldn't sleep, he'd trace circles on my wrist with a fingertip and whisper, 2 more mornings, as if hope could be borrowed on installment. And then there were none. And the house kept counting anyway. That night, the question came like a moth to the porch light. What did we teach them, not the bedtime lessons or the dinner table speeches? Those are theater. I mean the curriculum of watching Mike, seeing me write checks. When Bills cried wolf, Kelly seeing me say yes because no would bruise a feeling. Did they learn that love equals coverage? That if you're important enough, someone else will make late night into morning for you? We taught punctuality and table manners and how to address an envelope, but what they memorized was that I would bend. I don't want to be unkind to the people I made with my own body, but truth is not a blade. It is a level set on a board. It shows you where the tilt is, somewhere between the second mortgage and the third missed birthday call. Kindness turned into cushion. Cushions make falls softer. They also make jumping easier. I scrolled again because habits don't know how to mourn. Mike on the 9th hole, driver gleaming like he'd polished it with relief. Killer swing, perfect weather, Kelly in a spa robe, mask cracking into a grin. The caption joked about maintenance. I smiled the way dry wood does quietly, then not at all. Their lives looked clean, algorithmic. Mine looked like a drawer full of rubber bands and warranties. The contrast wasn't new. It was only louder now that the organ had fallen silent. I let the screen go dark and held the rectangle of it in my palm. The phone was warm from my hand. Warmth is such a liar. They're fine, I said to the half-lit room, testing whether the sentence would poison me. It didn't. It just sat there. A fact among facts, they are fine, and I am not, and both conditions are reasonable to the people feeling them. I tried the television. The anchor smiled with the bright, tireless teeth of a person whose job is to be believed. Storm systems, markets, a dog rescued from a drain America, trimmed and captioned. The noise felt borrowed, like wearing someone else's cardigan close enough to warm, too far to belong. I clicked it off and the silence returned. Heavier because it came back on purpose. There's a decibel to grief no instrument measures. It's the sound of a second cup you don't pour, of a chair that never scoots, of Sunday finding no church in you. I stood in the doorway of the den and listened to the clock on the hall. In our first apartment, that clock had been too loud. We joked that time was bragging. Tonight, it only counted. Bragging requires witnesses. I put my palm on the wall as if the house had a pulse I could steady. I poured another inch of wine clarity, not courage, and heard Walt's voice the way you hear a familiar song through a door. Legacy isn't what you leave, it's who you leave it to. At the time, I thought he meant grandchildren and scholarships and the sort of plaque that makes a hallway pretend to remember you. Now I understand the grammar of it. Who is weighted, to is a direction. You don't bequeath dollars, you bequeath a chance to continue a way of seeing. If money is the vessel, then character is the water. And water, left unattended, finds the lowest place. I laid the glass down on a coaster we bought at a garage sale, the kind carved with a lighthouse. Lighthouses don't move toward ships. They stay where they are and make the staying bright. I wanted, suddenly, not to be a harbor for every weather. Morning has a different honesty. I woke with my jaw unclenched and the kind of certainty that doesn't need volume. I set the kettle, swept the crumbs no one would notice, wrote a list I didn't second guess. At 9 on the dot, I called Dan Harper. He'd buried half this town's secrets in well-drafted clauses. He knew the shape of regret and the price of delay. Dan, it's Maggie Lawson, I said when the receptionist put me through. I need to revise my will, today. He asked if there'd been a change in circumstances, only in my tolerance. I said, we set a time. I hung up and stood at the sink, letting the hot water run because I could. Out the window, the roses were bare but upright. Surrender with dignity. Walt used to say. I dried my hands on a towel we bought in 1984 and reached for the folder labeled Estate. It was time, it was. I slid open Walt's file cabinet, the rails sighing like an old man settling into a chair. Folders stood at attention in his blocky handwriting house. Taxes, family. The last drawer was labeled Estate, the ink heavier, as if he'd pressed the pen harder for the future. I pulled the folder free and carried it to the kitchen table. The command center of our marriage, still scarred with rings from coffee cups and holiday pies. Inside copies of wills, beneficiary forms, notarized signatures, a list of accounts, an inventory of objects that had somehow grown into heirlooms. Walt had paper-clipped everything. Neat as fence posts in fresh snow. He'd even tucked a post-it on top for when the world forgets what we planned. I wasn't ready for how familiar his order felt against the chaos of the last days. I laid my palm flat, as if to bless it. Paper doesn't lie. It just waits for you to read yourself in it. Each page had his steadiness in it, the tidy margins, the initialed corners, the way he dated in full, as if abbreviations wasted dignity. Our signatures looked younger 2 years ago, like people we used to be. My hand trembled, not with age hands don't forget the work they've done, but with a pulse that had nowhere decent to go. Betrayal has a temperature, mine ran hot under the skin. Here it was the careful ladder of our life, pointed straight up to 2 children who couldn't give their father 2 hours. The law does not account for absence. It counts bodies and names. It does not measure chairs left empty or pews left bright. I read the clauses twice, as if more reading could change the verbs. Bequeath, devise, distribute, words marching toward people who'd chosen another march. I set the stack down and pressed my thumb to the notarized seal, the gold flaked slightly ceremony, pretending to be protection. The arithmetic was brutal in its simplicity. A career built nail by nail, ledger by ledger, a marriage that made interest in all the quiet ways compromise. Coffee, mowing the lawn in July, all of it translated to lines that pointed toward Mike and Kelly like arrows on a treasure map they hadn't bothered to follow to a graveside. People say it's what your father would have wanted, as if he were a man of equations, not of evenings and apple slices saved for me. Would he want this a son polishing a driver while a coffin descended? A daughter captioning brunch while a bell misfired? The will didn't know those images. It knew our old intent, faithful to a promise that no longer matched the faces. My chest tightened, not with grief exactly, but with an old habit snapping. I thought of the roses, how you cut what refuses to bloom so the rest can live. Some gardens require a hard season. I reached for the albums because paper that smiles might soften paper that sentences. Plastic sleeves whispered as I turned them. Glossy childhoods looked up without guilt. There was Mike, 12, asleep in Walt's lap after fishing, a paperback tented on Walt's chest. There was Kelly, grass-stained and gap-toothed, begging for just one more story. I traced their faces through the plastic, the way a monk might worry a bead. It is dangerous to let memory plead a case against the present. It will always bring too much evidence. Still, I flipped. Birthdays hosted on shoestrings we braided into garlands. Halloween costumes made from old curtains and imagination. Their small hands wrapped around our fingers like anchors we were proud to drag. I waited for anger to dissolve into mercy. It didn't. Love can hold the whole archive and still write a boundary in the margin. Not for neglect, not anymore. I closed the book and let the room exhale. I cried the way a house cries quietly, in the joints, no sobs, no wet spectacle. Just a tightening in the throat and the undeniable thud of blood reminding me I was alive, which felt rude. Tears are a currency. Mine had been overspent at hospital windows and insurance desks. What came now was a steadier payment, breath in, breath out, a metronome counting down to a decision. I laid my cheek on the cool table and listened to the refrigerator purr, the clock chew seconds, the wind reconsider the eaves. There is a sorrow so dense it doesn't leak, it compacts. You learn not to chase it with tissues. You let it settle into a shape you can carry. Walt would have said, finish the chore you're avoiding, then the next. I lifted my head and wiped nothing away. There wasn't anything to prove. The pen on the folder waited like a tool in a careful hand. I picked it up, I dialed Dan and got the polite wall. He's in a meeting. Good. Let him be busy. I needed a record, not a performance. The beep came, and my voice surprised me low, even, a level drawn across a warped board. Dan, it's Maggie Lawson. I need to revise my will. Urgent. I added the sentence that mattered today. I hung up and stared at the red light on the old answering machine as if it might nod. Action has its own kind of anesthesia. You move, and the pain falls behind a step or two. I stacked the documents, clipped them again, wrote a list on an envelope because the good pads were in the drawer I didn't want to open. Bank, beneficiaries, deed to the lake place, the clock from Walt's grandfather. The house breathed around me, unoffended by my plans. If a life is a ledger, then clarity is the line you draw when the numbers refuse to lie. Morning's light was clean and a little cruel. I took the pruning shears to the roses first, because some decisions prefer the company of another blade. Cut at an angle, don't baby the deadwood. Leave what can carry sugar back in spring. My mother taught me that, and time agreed. Thorns snagged my sleeve as if to ask whether I was sure. I am, I said aloud, surprised to hear the words land. The air had that October metal in it, bright and thin. When I finished, the canes looked severe but honest. There's mercy in naming what won't leaf again. I washed my hands at the kitchen sink, pink scratches blooming on my wrists like punctuation. The kettle hissed. I let it. Then I put on Walt's windbreaker, still holding the faintest echo of him, and carried the estate folder to the car. The passenger seat took it like a companion. The garden, newly ruthless, watched me leave without apology. Dan's office smelled like old books and eucalyptus polish, the kind of scent that suggests both memory and disinfectant. He'd known us 3 decades mortgages, licenses, that messy 1999 refinance we swore we'd never do again. He stood as I entered, his tie a little tired, his eyes sharper than his suit. Maggie, he said, and the name felt like a bench to sit on. We did not waste each other's time. Are you sure, he asked, after I laid the folder between us? I buried my husband alone. Dan, I said, I'm sure. He nodded once, the way a man nods when a nail seats with a final tap. He opened a legal pad, yellow paper, tidy lines. Remove Michael Lawson and Kelly Reed from all provisions. He repeated as he wrote, Everywhere, I said. Bank, house, lake place, the Dublin clock. He paused, and in their place I let the word arrive before I spoke at Aidan. Dan read the clause aloud, so there'd be no ghost of misunderstanding. All prior bequests to Michael Lawson and Kelly Reed are hereby revoked. Paper doesn't flinch, but I watched his pen hover, the way a surgeon hesitates a heartbeat before the first cut. Initial here, and at the bottom, he said. My initials marched across the margins like small, stubborn flags. He slid over the beneficiary schedules. The TOD forms, the transfer on death designations I'd once filled with faith instead of thought. We'll also update the life insurance and the payable on death for your checking. I nodded. The fluorescent light hummed like a nervous choir. This changes the temperature of holidays, Dan said. Not unkindly. Holidays have been lukewarm for years. I answered. We took inventory line by line: house, lake cabin, investment account, Walt's tools, the Dublin clock. When he reached personal effects, he glanced up. That can be as wide as grief, he warned. Good, I said. Let it hold what matters, and nothing that doesn't. Replacement beneficiaries, Dan said, his voice in that careful register people use around broken glass. You stated Aidan full name Aidan Reed. I answered, tasting each syllable like a test I meant to pass. He typed, keys clacking in a rhythm that felt like someone building a bridge plank by plank. Relationship grandson, I said, and the word placed a hand on my shoulder. Due diligence began birth date, current address, whether any guardianship issues remained. He's 19, I added, more adult than most on Sundays. Dan's eyebrows made a modest confession of surprise. We'll need to guard him from enthusiasm. 19 can be generous to a fault. So is 60, I said. Draft the guardrails. He outlined options: testamentary trust versus inter vivos, revocable versus irrevocable. If you want this to be pressure-proof, he concluded, we talk irrevocable. I looked at the yellow pad, at my initials drawing on a page that would change the weather of our name. Irrevocable, I said. Make the word earn itself. He asked why Aidan, and I told him with ordinary evidence. He shows up, I said, not with a list, just with hands. One July he mowed my lawn without asking, then stayed to fix a hose that had been pretending to work. He brings library books and asks what I think before he tells me what the internet thinks. When his robotics camp needed a fee years ago, I paid. He sent a thank you note with a pancake doodled in the corner because that's what we'd made that morning. He doesn't post our moments. He keeps them. Last winter, when Walt's hands shook, Aidan learned the routine without instructions: pill sorter, warm socks in the dryer first, quiet jokes that didn't make pain feel stupid. He listens, I added, and Dan, a man paid to listen, actually looked up. Listening is a form of stewardship. I nodded. And stewardship is what a house, a cabin, and a clock require more than cash ever will. We built the trust like a good fence, straight, sturdy, with a gate that asks a question before it opens. Irrevocable trust for the benefit of Aidan Reed. The heading announced in its courtroom voice. Dan penciled terms. I translated them into promises. Principal locked until 30, distributions for education, health, and a first home considered with prudence, not panic, no loans to parents, no assignments, no convenient temporary holds that turn into siphons. We can appoint a corporate trustee, he offered. I shook my head. Give him the option of an advisor. Let decisions remain a thing he must practice. We added a letter of wishes softer than law, but pointed about gardens to be planted, repairs to be learned, and the kind of hospitality that doesn't post itself. This is your voice later, Dan said, tapping the paragraph. Later is where I'm writing from, I answered. We chose contingencies the way you choose who gets a spare key, carefully, with a picture of the door in mind. The signatures took their time the way weather does, inevitable once it's decided. I signed my name and felt a click low in my chest, like a drawer finally sliding flush. We'll courier the originals and file the appropriate notices, Dan said. The room exhaled. I didn't feel triumphant. Triumph is loud. Clarity is quiet. What I felt was a steadying, the difference between balancing and finally standing on both feet. For years, I'd been a human elastic band, snapping back to shape around everyone else's emergencies. Today, I set my own edges and found they held. Dan gathered the papers, stacking them with the calm of a man who knows that order is a kind of mercy. There will be fallout, he said, because lawyers respect gravity. There already was, I answered, thinking of pews unoccupied and bells off key. He offered me water and I took it room temperature, honest. When I left, the folder was lighter. The future inside it wasn't, but my hands were outside. October had ironed the sky smooth. I stood on the sidewalk and let the air take a full measure of me. The eucalyptus of Dan's office gave way to leaf and exhaust, and bakery sugar, a town doing what towns do, forgetting. Forgiving, continuing. I walked to the car without the old scramble of second-guessing nipping at my heels. At a red light, I didn't check my phone. It lay in my bag like a child finally asleep. A mother and daughter crossed in front of me, their laughter threaded with errand lists. I wanted good things for them that didn't require a ledger to prove it. I parked by the coffee shop Walt liked for its simple mugs, and sat where the window made the street a moving picture. No soundtrack, no edit. I sipped slowly. Freedom doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it's a cappuccino you drink all the way hot. When I rose, the day felt the same size, only now it fit. Back home, I opened the drawer that had never told a lie. Folders labeled in my hand. Mike Education Business, Kelly Home Lifestyle. Receipts like thin fossils. $25,000 seed money for Mike's Sure Thing startup that folded by Christmas. $20,000 when Kelly's husband was laid off wired within an hour. No questions. $7,800 roof leak, crib soaked. $12,000 braces for Aiden, $5,000 robotics camp. The list continued like a rosary you repeat until meaning turns into muscle. I'd kept copies not from suspicion, but from habit. Now the columns spoke with a different accent, not generosity, but pattern. Between the lines sat birthdays missed, gratitude voiced, and then quickly spent. Vacations posted from beaches I paid for without seeing. I touched each check image as if it might warm, as if proof could comfort. It didn't accuse, it simply testified. The math wasn't cruel, it was cumulative. Love had underwritten a lot of life. Love had also been used like overdraft protection. I sat back and let the ledger become a mirror. For years, I'd been the bank that never closed. The line of credit extended on trust and Sunday dinners. You always save us, Kelly once whispered after a transfer cleared. She meant it as thanks, and maybe it was. But repeated thanks become script. Scripts become expectations. Expectations become entitlement in a nicer coat. Mike would call with that particular tone. A blend of urgency and charm, like a waiter recommending the special. I complied because emergencies are persuasive, and the mother in me hated to see a table empty. No one asked if I was tired. That's not an indictment, it's an observation. People rarely audit the account they're drawing from. I should have said no sooner. Should is another ledger. And I'm done with that book. What remains is a balance due to my self-hours returned, boundaries reinstated, the interest of peace compounding in quiet. I kept one envelope out of the drawer, the one that didn't ask me for anything. Aiden's handwriting, too heavy for the paper, denting the page the way sincerity does. "Thank you for teaching me pancakes," it began, the G in pancakes like a hook that caught my thumb when I traced it. He was 11 then, proud of a flip that didn't tear, proud of making breakfast into a small ceremony. "One day, I will take care of you the way you take care of me. Kids say galaxies, you don't bank them, but some stars keep showing up in the same part of the sky." I leaned against the counter and read it twice, then a third time with my hand flat over the words. Gratitude is a seed that doesn't mind poor soil. It waits. Maybe he didn't remember writing it. I did. and the woman I was when I saved it remembered how hope feels when it's still small enough to hold. I slid the other folders back into their slots, order restored, but with a new label in my head, not owed. The room had that late afternoon hush when light stops arguing with furniture. I whispered the sentence that had been building all day, testing its joints like a carpenter. Fairness isn't sameness. Fairness is giving to the one who honors the gift. The words didn't crack. They didn't even echo. They settled. Walt's lighthouse coaster sat under my glass, steadfast as ever. A boundary is not a wall when it faces the sea. It's a shoreline firm where it must be, yielding where it can. Honest about the tide. Tomorrow there will be phone calls and the choreography of offense. Today there is a woman in her kitchen, deciding that love without respect will not be financed here anymore. I folded Aiden's note and set it on the mantel where I'd see it when the story tried to rewrite itself. Then I turned toward the evening and the next right task. Kelly didn't text or call. She arrived like weather. Her black SUV grinding gravel as if outrage needed traction. She didn't bother with the bell. The door opened and there she was, sunglasses like a visor in a game I wasn't playing. She scanned the hallway as if inventorying what might soon be hers. "Mom!" Her voice tried to sound casual and landed hard. I kept folding towels at the dining table, domestic armor. She set her keys down where Walt used to drop his mail. A trespass small as a paper cut and just as sharp. "We need to talk," she declared, a phrase people use when what they mean is, "We need you to agree." I gestured to a chair and kept matching corners. Linen to linen. The house watched us with its steady windows. She's my daughter. I reminded the part of me that wanted to hold her and the part that wanted to hold the line. Both truths stayed in the room. "I heard you changed your will," Kelly said, tearing the words like a perforated check. "I did," I answered. "Because you didn't come to your father's funeral." She flinched, then recovered with practiced speed. "Mom, that's not fair." The sentence found no footing. "Fair," I said, is a word that sounds good until it meets a calendar and a casket. She shifted, bracelets clinking like a tiny alarm. There were circumstances. She tried. There were chairs, I said, and they were empty. Silence found us then, not soft, not kind, accurate. She looked past me, as if the wall could testify that I'd misunderstood her entire life. I remembered her at 5, hiding behind my legs when a neighbor's dog barked. I wanted to shelter that child. The woman in front of me needed a boundary, not an umbrella. "We can still be honest," I offered, "but we cannot pretend." "I was busy," she blurted, and the words sat between us like a dropped fork. Busy is a story that writes itself. Busy with what I asked, not because I didn't know, but because saying it changes the air. "Appointments," she said. "Self-care, commitments," I couldn't move. I nodded toward the phone on the console. "And brunch." Her mouth tightened. "You stalked my social. I checked the weather where my children live." I said, "It was sunny." We both knew I'd seen more than sunlight mimosas. Hashtags, the wide-open grin of someone sure the world will stay padded. "I'm not on trial," she said. "Neither is your father," I replied. "Anymore." She crossed her arms, the universal sign for a heart drawing up the drawbridge. I set the last towel on the stack and met her eyes. "You chose to be elsewhere on the only day he needed you to be here. The day didn't need a defense." I began folding shirts, Walt's t-shirts I still use for gardening. Slow, square, familiar. "This isn't punishment," I said, smoothing a sleeve. "It's the end of underwriting." She blinked. "Under what? The quiet financing of other people's priorities." I said, "I'm closing that account." She laughed, brittle. "So you're cutting me off." "I'm cutting off the belief that love equals coverage." I answered, "Adults can fund their own decisions." The word adult put a new edge on the table. She looked around for sympathy and found furniture. "You're being dramatic," she said. "No," I told the cotton and the air. I'm being specific. I placed the shirts in the basket, a small choreography of order. You can visit, you can call, you can start again, I added. But you can't invoice me for your life anymore. The house creaked, not from age, from agreement. She stared like she'd never seen me tell the truth, without apologizing for its shape. You're breaking this family, she said, and her voice finally trembled where it had been all steel. I softened, but not in the direction she expected. I'm releasing myself, I said, from the role none of you noticed had become a job. Her eyes went glassy, a sheen that could signal tears or strategy. We needed you, she tried. Needing isn't wrong, I said. Assuming is. She opened her hands, palms up, the gesture of someone discovering the stage props are real. So that's it, no, I said gently. That's the beginning. I pointed to the chair. Sit, if you want to talk about how we repair. She stayed standing. Pride prefers altitude. I waited. Waiting used to be my weakness. Today, it was a tool. When she realized I wouldn't rush to pad the silence with comfort, she picked up her keys. Metal clinked like a bell that calls a service I no longer held. She left a note on the hall table, no envelope. Hurried pen. You don't understand us. The sentence tried to make distance virtuous. I read it under the porch light because truth deserves illumination. Then I filed it where it belonged in the drawer labeled miscellaneous, the museum of things that once demanded a room and now fit in a pocket. I didn't roll my eyes. Contempt is just another tether. I made tea instead, the kind you brew when you intend to stay awake to yourself. Steam lifted, quiet held. I thought about the word us, how it can mean family or conspiracy depending on who claims it. I rinsed the mug and set it to dry. Not every message asks for a reply. Some ask for a boundary. I turned off the porch light, a small ceremony of stewardship, and locked the door the way Walt used to tap confirming the world could spin without my thumb on it. The next day, Mike knocked like someone auditioning for good manners. Diane hovered behind him, wrapped in a scarf that announced its price. Mom, he said, the syllable shaped for negotiation. Come in, I offered, because civility is a chair I still set out. They sat in the living room and didn't take off their coats. Exit strategy masquerading as chill. He cleared his throat. We heard there were changes. Diane smiled the way people smile in glossy brochures. We just want to make sure you're protected, she said, as if concern had a trademark. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and last night's soup, a combination that tells the truth about a life clean enough, fed enough, no performance scheduled. I folded my hands in my lap. I'm protected, I said, by decisions you don't need to like. Mike's jaw twitched. He has his father's bone structure, and my old habit of thinking charm could solve math. I let them talk first. It's a kindness and a strategy. Give people the rope they intend as a leash, and it becomes an outline. Words poured misunderstandings, timing. You know how business is. We assumed. We'll step up more. I listened until their sentences began to rhyme. Then I set mine down like a keel. Forgiveness, I said, doesn't mean access. The line landed without echo because the room understood it. Mike blinked as if a light had changed. Diane's smile narrowed, then steadied. That seems harsh, she offered. Harsh, I said, was an empty pew. She looked at the framed photo of Walt by the mantel. Him in a cap, his grin soft and certain, and chose not to argue with the dead. You always told us family comes first, Mike said. Last card turned. I did. I answered. I was wrong to define first as no matter what. The silence afterward wasn't hostile. It was honest. Diane surprised me. She leaned forward, scarf loosened like a concession, and said, Walt told me once that you were the strongest person he knew. The compliment arrived unadorned, no barter attached, and I felt it like a hand to a shoulder I didn't know was aching. I didn't understand him, she added, until now. Something in Mike's face shifted pride, injury, both. He looked at the photo too, like a man checking a compass he'd ignored. "We can do better," he said, and for a second I believed him. But belief is not a contract, and I was finished signing promises for other people. "Doing better doesn't reopen what I closed," I said. Diane nodded, not in defeat, in recognition. "That's fair," she admitted, and the word had weight this time. It wasn't a plea, it was a level. We breathed together, 3 adults in a room learning the dimensions of a new map. They stood when the talk had the decency to end. Coats back on, politeness rebuttoned. At the door, Mike hesitated, then hugged me like a man hugging the idea of his mother. I let him. Diane squeezed my hand, quick and human. "Take care of yourself," she said. And for once, it didn't sound like a dismissal, it sounded like permission. When the latch clicked behind them, my knees remembered their age and trembled. A small aftershock of choosing yourself in a house built for others. I sat on the stairs and listened to the quiet come home. It didn't press this time. It settled a cat in a window, sure of its patch of sun. I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't ruined. I was clear, outside. Wind moved the last leaves like applause that knew better than to be loud. I stood, smoothed the banister Walt had sanded twice, and walked toward the kitchen to put water on for tea. The next day, my phone rang with a name I hadn't seen in months. Grandma Aiden's voice was thin at the edges, like paper held too close to a flame. "Is it true? Did Grandpa—" He couldn't finish. He passed, I said, and the room tilted the way it always does when you say the fact out loud. "Mom didn't tell me," he whispered, a new kind of grief secondhand and still sharp. I closed my eyes. There are failures I cannot fix, only witness. "Come," I said, "now, if you can." He said he'd be here in an hour. I made lemonade because he still pretends to like mine better than anything in a bottle. While the ice cracked in the pitcher, I remembered him at 8, building towers of dominoes and refusing to cry when they fell. He'd say, again, like the word was a window. I set out 2 glasses. The house breathed, bracing itself for a good thing. He arrived taller, the air around him carrying laundry soap and worry. We hugged the way people do when they're not sure which grief belongs to whom. Tentative. Then all at once, when the ribs remember. He didn't apologize for the time. Apologies can't re-edit a calendar. "I should have been there," he said. "You're here now." I answered, and meant it. We sat in the living room that had learned our shapes. He looked around as if the furniture might give him instructions. "Is it okay if I—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. He took Walt's chair and didn't sink. He settled, careful, like a man entering a story mid-chapter. I poured lemonade. He took a sip and made the same face he made at 11, too tart, too honest. We didn't fill the silence with explanations. Some rooms require only presence. I handed him the manila envelope without a preface. The weight of it changed his posture. He opened the folder the way some people open a Bible, respect and a little fear. His eyes moved, left to right, the way responsibility first enters a body. "Grandma, this is—" He stopped because big words can choke when they collide with a beating heart. "It's a plan," I said, "and a promise." He skimmed the terms, found his name repeated where other names used to live, and looked up quickly, like a diver checking the surface. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because it's yours to carry, right," I said. He traced a line with his finger, the clause about education, about a first home, about no loans to parents. I watched comprehension ripen into resolve. He set the papers down gently, as if they were a bird he meant to release. "I don't know what to say," he whispered. "Say you'll try," I answered. He nodded, jaw set. That was the yes I'd hoped for. "Why me?" he finally asked, not fishing, genuinely worried he'd stolen someone else's seat. "Because you're the only one who came back without being called," I said. His eyes filled in the clean way men's eyes do, when no one has taught them yet how to hide the flood. He wiped at his face with the heel of his hand, embarrassed. "Don't apologize for water," I said, laying my palm on his shoulder. The muscle there felt like a hinge ready to take weight. This is not a reward, I added. It's a responsibility garden. Porch, promises. He smiled at Porch like a man already measuring boards. I'll learn, he said. I know, I answered, because he'd been learning me his whole life, my rhythms, my recipes, my refusal to make a fuss. He folded the trust summary back into the envelope and held it to his chest, not possessive, protective. The difference is the whole story. He cried then, not as a boy collapsing, but as a man allowing. The sound was small and exact, like ice settling in a full glass. I didn't hand him a tissue. I placed my hand on his shoulder and let his breath recalibrate against my steadiness. Live the way you showed up, I said. That's all I'm asking. He nodded, eyes wet but clear. We talked about practical things to give tears somewhere to go, how to winterize the cabin, where the breaker box is, why the basement always smells like a lesson. He asked if he could come Saturday to fix the porch rail that wobbles when it thinks I'm not watching. Bring real tools, I said, and he grinned. Before he left, he looked at Walt's photo and whispered, I'll take care of her. He didn't know I heard. I didn't tell him. Some vows prefer to be overheard by the room that needs them. Carol knocked at 5 with a tin of lemon shortbread and the permission to be nosy. We've been neighbors since the bicentennial. Our friendship is a fence you can lean on. I saw Mike's car yesterday, she said. Did he bring flowers or just explanations? Explanations, I said, and we both hummed the national anthem of our generation. She set the tin down and looked at me like a nurse checking a chart. Well, she said, it seems you finally woke up. Not woke, I corrected, unburdened. She nodded, pleased with the nuance. We sat with our different teas, hers chamomile, mine black, and let the kind of silence that heals come in and make itself a sandwich. Cutting them out will make you the villain at 3 dinner tables, she warned, not unkindly. I removed their access, I said, not their mother. She smiled. Language matters. So do locks, I replied, and we both laughed like women who've learned the price of spare keys. After Carol left, I opened a drawer I hadn't dared in years and pulled out Walt's first road trip letter. The paper had yellowed into the color of remembered kitchens. His block letters still leaned a little to the right, impatient in a tender way. This house is never empty with you in it. You are the roof, the floorboards, and the lock on the door. I read it once for meaning, once for the cadence. I can still hear when he said my name, and once more to memorize the sentence that would have to stand in for a hand at the small of my back. I see you. Grief rearranges furniture you thought was bolted down. Love leaves notes where you'll eventually look. I slid the letter back into its envelope and, without ceremony, felt taller by half an inch. The house didn't echo. It answered. The next morning I walked because I wanted to no prescription pickup, no casserole to deliver, no favor disguised as errands. The air had that crisp honesty that October does, the kind that edits you. I wore Walt's windbreaker and let it hang like permission. Maple leaves littered the sidewalk with the confidence of exit. At the park, the old elm leaned the way it has since '99 when the storms split it and it decided to keep living crooked. I sat on the bench with the plaque for a man I never knew and tried on the idea that I had time unassigned, unbilled. Joggers passed, strollers squeaked, a dog with opinions announced them all. My feet found their own patience. I didn't narrate the walk to myself. I let the neighborhood speak in gutters and birds. It said you are allowed. A woman took the other end of my bench, the middle-aged kind of tired that still makes lists. We shared the neutral nod of strangers, then she sighed into the kind of truth that doesn't need a preface. My daughter says she doesn't want kids, she said, watching a stroller roll by as if irony were a parade. I told her that's ridiculous, and then I heard my mother in my mouth. I smiled because lineage is not just blood, it's sentences we inherit. What did she say, I asked? She said she wants a life that feels like hers. The words rang like a small bell I recognized. Maybe that's what you wanted too. I offered. We talked for 10 minutes about nothing that would make a plot and everything that makes a day, tattoos and tuition, casseroles and careers. She left first, lighter by a half ounce. I stayed, surprised to find my chest not tight. Alive isn't loud, it's accurate. That evening I made a proper dinner for one roast chicken. Potatoes that crisped exactly where they should. Green beans with a snap like good decisions. I set the table with the nice plates because any day I want can be occasion enough. I lit a candle not to romance the room, to mark it. The radio murmured a station Walt tolerated for the talk, and I like for the quiet between. I ate without a phone, without a hurry, without narrating the meal to a future audience. Full is a feeling and a philosophy, after dishes. I put on a record that still skips in the third chorus. Walt used to say the scratch gave it character. I think it gives it honesty, beauty with a seam showing. I danced badly in socks on wood he refinished twice, laughed once out loud at nothing, and felt I tried the word on sufficient. Not alone is absence, alone is room. The envelope was thick, the kind that makes you stand up before you open it. Aiden's handwriting leaned hard, denting the paper with its earnestness. Dear Grandma, it began, thank you for seeing me for who I am. No decoration, no performance, just the sentence I didn't know. My ribs had been waiting to hear. He wrote about the porch rail and a YouTube rabbit hole on mortise and tenon joints. He wrote about wanting to learn the house the way you learn a person where it creaks, where it warms, what it refuses. He promised nothing dramatic, only to show up and keep showing up. He said he'd started a list tools to buy, skills to ask me for, recipes to memorize before they hide themselves. At the bottom he drew a tiny pancake and a crooked heart that looked exactly like truth when it refuses to be perfect. I pressed the page flat and felt my posture change, like someone had removed a weight I'd mistaken for bone. I read the letter once straight through, breath caught at the hinge of each line, then again, slower, marking the places where his words sounded older than 19, not jaded, responsible. The third time I didn't so much read as listen. You can hear character when it speaks from a quiet place. My smile arrived first, unannounced, softening the muscles that grief had been renting. Then the tears, the good kind, the kind that rinse, not erode. I let them come without apology. The table took them, the room held them, the day didn't argue. I folded the letter along its creases, unfolded it, then set it on the mantel where the late light could bless it. Walt would have tapped the paper and said, "That's a keeper." I said it for him and for me. Some sentences belong in a house like family photos. Evidence that love learned how to speak in the language of staying. In the afternoon, Diane appeared on the porch, holding an apple pie that confessed its store-bought edges. No entourage, no performance. She stood straighter than usual, as if she'd left her armor in the car. "May I?" she asked, and for the first time since I'd known her, the question sounded like a question. I made tea because that is what I do when a conversation needs both hands. We sat at the kitchen table, the pie between us like a truce offering. She didn't glance around to appraise. She looked at me the way people do when they've rehearsed telling a truth and are terrified they'll lose their nerve. "I didn't come to ask for anything," she said. "Good," I answered, and meant it kindly. The radiator ticked. The house waited. Diane breathed in, out, then set her purse on the floor, a small surrender. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't say out loud," she began. "Thank you for not leaving the estate to Mike," she said, eyes steady, voice not. "He needs to learn how to stand on his own, and I've been helping him avoid that lesson." Honesty traveled the room like a draft that makes you retuck a blanket. She touched the pie box with 2 fingers. "A nervous anchor. I've benefited from it too," she admitted. "The way things were, easy, too easy to call you when a bill felt rude or a plan fell apart." She met my gaze. "I'm tired of being part of the cushion." I thought of all the soft things that had been asked to bear weight. "He'll blame me," I said. "Probably," she agreed. but I wanted you to hear one voice that won't. Walt's photo watched us without taking sides, learned to tell the truth without asking it to adore you. I told myself and her. Diane nodded, as if receiving an assignment she'd already begun. She reached into her coat and pulled out a worn photo Aiden at 5 on my backyard swing. Knees dirty, grin lawless. She'd kept it, tucked somewhere private where it could argue with bad days. He loves you, she said. You know that? Right, I nodded, and something eased between my shoulder blades. Don't let them rewrite this story, she added. And the plea wasn't performative. It sounded like a woman who'd watched revisionism pass as coping. I won't, I said. Not because I need to win a narrative, but because I finally learned to title the chapters correctly. She smiled small, real. We ate pie that tasted better than it had a right to. Before she left, she squeezed my forearm, a gesture more intimate than a hug. On the porch, she looked younger in the cold, like the lacquer had cracked to show wood. Take care, she said. It didn't sound like dismissal. It sounded like solidarity whispered through a scarf. After the door closed, I stood in the doorway a moment longer, letting the house rebalance. Conversations like that add and subtract in the bones. I washed the plates, listening to the small sermon of hot water and ceramic. Then I dried my hands, walked to the mantel, and straightened Aiden's letter beside Walt's photo. Action, not argument. I spoke to the room because the room remembers. I've already rewritten it, I said. Not with speeches, with signatures and boundaries, and who gets a spare key. The air held the sentence the way fabric holds a new seam. I thought of all the years I'd performed peace like a service, how it always unraveled by morning. This felt different, stitched into the structure. The kettle clicked off. I left it. Some comforts can wait. I turned off the lamp, not to darken the place, but to let the evening own its color. Peace, I was learning, prefers verbs. A week later, the bank's envelope arrived white, official, impersonal in the way true things often are. Inside confirmations, stamped and countersigned, the trust active, beneficiaries amended, old links severed with surgical exactness. Mr. Jansen's letter used phrases like hereby affected and irrevocably designated, language as dry as good kindling. I didn't need poetry. I needed proof. I ran my finger along each line until the paper warmed. No fanfare, no confetti, just a corridor of decisions leading to a door that closed with the clean click of a well-made latch. I slid the documents back into their folder and felt a quiet recalibration, the kind you notice only when drawers stop sticking. Outside, the mail truck sighed away. I made a copy for the safe and one for the file marked simply Aiden. The label looked right. Legacy, Walt had said, is who you leave it to. Today, the sentence had a file number. I took the envelope to the garden because some news deserves a witness who doesn't talk back. The roses were stripped to canes, thorns honest, silhouettes spare as bone, bare, but upright Walt's favorite phrase for dignity. I sat on the weathered bench and let the weak sun do what it could. This plot had held so many versions of me, the novice planter. The mother hiding from a tantrum, the wife bargaining with a diagnosis, the widow counting minutes. Today it held a woman who had completed a difficult kindness for herself. I read the bank's letter again with dirt under my nails, and it somehow meant more there. A gust rattled the canes, they didn't bend enough to touch. We'll bloom again, Walt used to say, then add, not for everyone. I smiled into the dry air, not bitterness, boundary. I tucked the envelope into my coat and stood. The bench groaned its old complaint, then forgave me. Inside, I lifted the sewing machine from the closet, like a relic that knows your hands by name. A dab of oil, a threaded bobbin, the foot pedal testing its nerve. I'd bought fabric on a whim months ago, blue too bright for a cautious house. I cut, pinned, and fed it through the needle. The motor's hum steady as a new vow. Stitch by stitch, the cloth obeyed, then became itself with help. That's what healing sounds like when it remembers it's also making not violins, but a small machine doing what it was built to do. I hung the new curtains while the light still knew the window. The color startled the room and then suited it, the way truth does. I stood back, pricked my finger, sucked the dot of red, and laughed quietly at the proof of making. I wasn't decorating grief. I was furnishing a future, a room I get to live in, one seam at a time. I gathered the scraps, triangles, moons, a thin ribbon of sky, and tied them with baker's twine for some later usefulness. I lowered the needle once more to tack the hem, then slipped a tiny crooked stitch on purpose. A private signature. In the drawer I found one of Walt's old work shirts. The elbow thinned to gauze. I patched it with a square from the same blue. A quiet treaty between what was and what's next. I opened the window an inch. The new curtains breathed, lifting and settling like a tide that now knew my name. Street sounds arrived, edited footsteps. A distant bus, the neighbor's gate, ordinary music for an ordinary afternoon. The kettle clicked and I let it wait. I wrote the date inside the hem, small as a secret, then made a list for tomorrow. Teach Aiden to thread a bobbin, sand the porch, plant time in spring, pancakes, always. I put the machine away gently. The house exhaled. So did I. I sat at Walt's old desk one last time, the same groove under my wrist, the same smell of cedar and ink. A single page lay waiting blank, patient. I wrote slowly, not to explain, but to release. You tried longer than you should have. You bent yourself into grace for people who never looked up to see it. But now you are free. Choose peace. Don't confuse love with obligation. I folded the letter, placed it in the drawer with the others, and whispered, "This one's for me." Outside, snow began to fall thin, deliberate, the world erasing its noise grain by grain. On the porch, Aiden was sanding the new railing, breath fogging in the cold. He looked up, caught my gaze, and smiled the kind of smile that builds things. I nodded back, no words needed. If your house is full of noise, but no one hears you, make a new kind of quiet one where you are no longer invisible. One where peace is something you choose, not something you wait for.